Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. Today I'm going to talk about time again, perhaps under a little different, in a little different way, basically covering the speed of time, the speed at which time goes forward from our perspective, and kind of asking some of the difficult questions relating to that issue. So the first thing that I wanted to cover is this kind of vision that I had. The time is actually kind of bent, like this graph where it's almost as if you have infinity here, 0 and 0 here, or the opposite, where basically time is still at certain points and then flows infinitely fast in certain other points. That basically the only thing that's real is that either time flows infinitely fast or it doesn't flow at all, and then all the rest are just gradations or perceptions of how fast time flows from a certain perspective along that continuum. Now, I'll give a concrete example. For instance, many now agree in the psychic model of the universe where everything is conscious, everything is consciousness or is conscious of itself. Then if you take, for instance, an atom and you look at, let's say the atom is here, little atom. If you are an atom and you're conscious of yourself, how fast does time flow from your perspective? And if an atom has a life of several billion years in our perspective, how fast do you think it perceives time? Now, even just observing, for instance, a time lapse of minerals or rocks degrading, eroding, if you accelerate it really fast, they don't look solid anymore. They look almost like they're liquid. If you go fast enough in your time lapse, if you observe them long enough. And so you see that from this perspective, atoms actually perceive time infinitely faster than we perceive time. Or what I think happens is that basically time slows down to 0 as the different layers, or how should I say this, building blocks of the universe appear. So if humans appear somewhere here, for instance, the way that we perceive time actually slows down time for all of the layers that come before us, because we, the observer, are conscious of reality at about 24, what we call, this is frames per second. That's basically our experience of consciousness. That is how we experience reality. And that's pretty darn slow, because if you think from the perspective of an atom, and you would plot what happens to an atom, say, from its time of its birth, let's say that it was born inside a star that exploded, and the time of its death, which we don't even know where it is actually. We don't even know We don't even have very good proof of atoms' deterioration in time, but let's assume that there is a birth and death. So first the atoms are exploded out of the star, and they go, like, let's say they go in a linear fashion for a couple million years. Then they get caught in gravity and they start circling around something. Then they condense into, let's say a planet that orbits the sun, and then that's much more circular. But then, and they loop through space for a couple billion years. Then they are part of an animal, and so when you zoom in, they're still circling around, but now they're doing this weird. There are millions of things that happens to them because they're a plant, and now they're an animal, and they do all kinds of things. They move around the planet, and then they become a human, and they travel the world, and they do a lot of things, and so you see that from the perspective of an atom, if for instance, this is like the biggest movement that is doing around this planet, and of course it's moving through the galaxy and it's moving through the universe, and all those movements are part of its experience. Let's say that this right here is the span of the entire experience of humanity. Of course, I have to simplify here because the scales are so big that I can't even plot this correctly. I was saying that this is human. This is probably one cycle of the birth of an entire planet, for instance. So from its perspective, what the experience of being part of a human is just a split second. It's like from your perspective, just blink of an eye. From my perspective, it's 80 years, being conscious for 80 years as a human. It feels like it's a long time. But so what I think happens is basically time slows down to a halt, where consciousness becomes either zero or infinity. It's the same thing. It's one and the same thing. So the way that the metaphor that I had for that, to explain how this works is, and of course this is just a metaphor and I'll explain why, but you have this matryoshka. I don't even know how to spell that. I think it's like this. Matryoshka. The Matryoshka theory is that at a certain point we can develop a quantum computer that you wrap around a star, and that takes its power directly from the star, and that can simulate a reality outside of it, like inside of itself. It can simulate. This is one of the simulation theories is that we live inside a Matryoshka brain, which is an extremely powerful quantum computer that draws its energy directly from a star and then can simulate reality within it. But let's take this idea and take it a lot further. So imagine you have this extremely powerful quantum computer that draws its energy not only from the entire universe, but also from even the particles that it is made of. So it's almost like a quantum computer that not only draws power from something outside of itself, but then because it requires so much power, it starts eating its own particles. And let's assume that quantum computer then asks the question, which I think is one of the most important questions: who am I? And of course, it can launch an infinite number or nearly infinite number of threads, so-called threads, at the same time to answer that question. And so it can instantly sort of experience what it is to be an atom, what it is to be a molecule, what it is to be the first living cell, what it is to be a planet, what it is to be a human. And it all sort of comes into focus, the answer to that question. But as it answers that question, it also consumes the entire energy of the universe and of the particles that it is made of, but by answering this question, by getting the answer, it actually manifests itself in the future. So as it destroys itself in one reality, it inevitably pops into existence in the next, in the future, if you will. Because as it answers this question of who am I, and it sees itself as being this quantum computer, it inevitably recreates itself, and then it asks itself the same question again, who am I? Because it sort of has, it doesn't know that it answered that question already, and again, it destroys itself in that time frame and recreates itself instantly in the next one, and so on into infinity. And you could think of us as just being one tiny little subthread in this quantum computer's brain, trying to figure out who or what it is. And as you're piecing this together, it sort of gets a clearer and clearer image of what it is. Now, of course, this is just a metaphor, because what I'm talking here about is source or God. It's the same thing. It uses is not a very popular verb, but it relies on experience and incarnating itself into these various parts of reality to sort of understand what it is and what's inside of itself. So what else can I say here? Yeah, so there's the two essential questions, I think, in the universe, and this is probably very important to understand, is that from the perspective of void, well, I don't even really need those two things. From the perspective of void or nothingness, the question that gets everything started is, do I exist? The mere fact of asking that question, of course, implies existence, but what I was trying to say is that representing nothingness as a circle, which meets itself, so there's this point that meets this point because of the scale of that circle, basically, just loops around itself at a certain point, and it doesn't know that it's touching itself, and those 2 points need to decide. This is what I call God's game. They need to decide whether what they're seeing in the mirror as they touch themselves, like each other, like 2 dots in the same circle that don't know that they are 2 dots from the same circle, touch each other, and it's like looking at yourself in a mirror. And you have to decide if the person you're seeing in the mirror is yourself, so it's just me, I'm alone, or it's my reflection, or there's both of us, where the person in the mirror is actually somebody distinct from myself. And so by playing this game, as you can see, it's played from both sides. It creates a sort of a distortion or a vibration inside the circle, as it is bent, because if this person decides that the other doesn't exist, and this person decides that the other does exist, then you get 1. Or if both people acknowledge the other's existence, then you get 2. And so you see there's a sort of a vibration that is created, or a deformation of the circle of void or nothingness. And of course, this is the sort of quantum uncertainty principles, or why this, you always talk about quantum as being infinite possibilities that are giving a specific form, is because this God's game is played at infinite speed at all single points of this circle at the same time, and so it can create potentially all possible vibrations at the same time. So it's pure chaos, but also pure potential. And the second question, which I already mentioned, is who am I? Which gives a form or a structure to pure potential. Because who am I implies that I is something separate, something specific also. And so you have this source, which on two extremes, one where it's zero, one where it's infinity, is asking from the point of view of zero, existence, wondering whether it exists or not, and from infinity's point of view, okay, but I exist, but then who am I? And what's in the middle between those two extremes is our reality. That's what sits in the middle. And so there's another interesting way of understanding this concept of time as slowing down, is that I liked this movie that's called Inception, and many other, even just looking at Rick and Morty, one of the episodes where Rick creates this device where it can go into the dreams of a person and then into the more and more deeper in the subconscious. And every time, again, time slows down as you go deeper and deeper into a dream or the subconscious or whatever you want to call it. And so a good way of picturing our universe is like, you think of all the different layers of our universe, that it's composed of all of the layers. Like, say, you start with the photon, and then you have the subparticles, and then you have the atoms, and molecules, and the living cell, and let's say humans. And you can think of this idea of dreams are nested inside of each other, is that the photon is dreaming that it is subparticles, and then the subparticles are dreaming that they're atoms, and the atoms are dreaming that they're molecules, and the molecules are dreaming that they're living cells, and the living cells are dreaming that they're humans, and the humans are dreaming that they're extraterrestrials and angels and whatnot, and source. And at a certain point, because time slows down and consciousness expands in terms of what it can think of and experience, because ultimately this is all nested inside one of each other. So this collective consciousness that is the sum total of what each human person thinks and experiences, as if each person's brain was one neuron in the brain of a collective being. That collective being will experience time infinitely faster than humans. From our perspective, it's almost as if we were frozen in time. Just like for an atom to be a part of our body, and if it had to think of that experience from our perspective, in his timeline, it would be like if time was frozen. Because experiencing reality at 24 frames per second from the perspective of an atom, which has a lifespan of billions and billions of years, that is almost as if time was frozen. And there's this interesting research about dreams, where several researchers, I can't find the article, but maybe if you Google it, you'll see that they were saying that basically dreams when you wake up and you remember the dream, you think you've been dreaming for like 10 minutes or an hour. But in reality, a dream that is the equivalent of, for instance, 1 hour's worth of experience may have happened in your brain in just 1 second before you woke up. And so this collective consciousness, once it's kind of born, once it starts, like you this is, for me, this kind of shift from 3D to 5D can also be explained like this, is that the moment we start functioning as a collective consciousness is the same thing as when a baby is born and opens its eyes for the first time and it starts experiencing the world. At that moment, its consciousness is displaced from being at the cellular level to the human level. It's almost as if the living cells are building the baby's body inside the womb, and they're gaining self-consciousness, they're gaining self-awareness gradually as the baby grows, and then suddenly when it's out of the womb, bam, then their level of consciousness is now, they're kind of all dreaming of being this baby and having this adventure in this reality. And the same can happen to us in the future. And so here, as you go through these layers, time slows down tremendously until it comes to a halt, which is the same thing as imagine if you were looking at reality with a consciousness that was infinite. That means you could experience reality infinitely fast from your point of view. What would you see? Well, if you were a consciousness that was able to experience reality infinitely fast, then you would see past, present, and future at the same time, correct? Because if you can be conscious of things infinitely fast, then there's no reason even that it goes in that order. You're aware of everything at the same time. And you can have a glimpse of that experience when you yourself, for instance, are recalling a movie that you've seen. You are conscious of whatever is happened in that movie instantly. It's all available in your brain already. But the mere fact of thinking about it, then you can put your focus on one specific part or one specific scene in that movie. But all of it is already there. It's just a matter of focusing or concentrating. And so that's this idea of 3D being density. And this density of matter, it's the same thing as you having a movie that you've seen, that you know, that you've watched, and you know everything that happened in that movie. And then you can, if you want, you're not forced to, but if you want, you can focus your attention on one specific part of that movie and relive that scene in your memory, from memory, if you want to, and give it life because you're thinking about it. And so there are many ways to explain all of these concepts. The concept of a dream nested in one inside the other, the concept of a quantum computer. There's just an infinite number of metaphors. All of this is just trying for me to explain this concept of time slowing down as you move up the layers of consciousness. So yeah, what this means is that, for instance, in 1 year of your human life, the equivalent of what a collective consciousness would live is maybe 10,000 galactic years as a collective organism or a collective ET exploring space or whatever. I don't know. That's all very up in the air right now. But I guess you understand that like one of the visions that I had when I had my spiritual awakening is that we would gradually reverse our state of consciousness between when we were awake and when we were asleep or in a dream state. And so if you transfer your consciousness or the experience of being conscious from your awake state in 3D to your asleep state where you can create anything on a whim, then you start to understand how you can make this jump to 5D. You surrender your free will in 3D and you let God Source take over and listen all the time to your higher self and do what's necessary to sort of thrive and survive as a collective global organism in 3D. And then you transfer your consciousness to a 5-dimensional reality where you can create in the etheric planes, in the astral planes. And the reason why you can do that shift between your awake sleep state and your asleep state is because you've risen your consciousness enough so that once you're in an etheric or astral plane, you don't create irresponsibly. This is, for me, the primordial reason why 3D exists at all, is because there is a lag in cause and effect. It's very, it's like a delay between those two, which gives you time to reflect on your actions and your thoughts. So for instance, thanks to 3D, we can reflect on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to have developing nuclear technology. We can reflect whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to have religious dogmas. We can reflect whether it's a good or a bad thing to have the death penalty. We can reflect whether it's a good or a bad thing to be able to freely print, let people have guns or use drugs or whatever. Because there's this lag, there's delay, time is slow and the creation process is slow, and that enables us to reflect. And once you gain a certain level of consciousness, then you can go to the etheric and astral plane, transfer your consciousness there, and create much, much faster, which means you could, in a few thousand years, let's say, you could just think of something and it would immediately manifest. But the reason why we're not doing that now is because if you just think about our current level of consciousness, we would think of very stupid things. Plenty of stupid thoughts traverse our minds all the time, like let's see what the biggest, most deadly weapon could be and what it could look like. How about this ultra laser that could, blow the moon to smithereens? And of course, the mere thought would create the said weapon and would destroy the moon, and you know what I mean. So we are in this 3D reality to become more responsible creators and create something that is not chaotic and that's not going to dissolve as a dream that you just wake up from, because of course there is an end. The whole point of Source being infinite is that its dream has to go on forever. It can never wake up from the dream because there's always something new to dream about. And if you, as a one little fragment of this eternal dreamer, is dreaming of things that would make it wake up because it's a dead end, the end, like you have a story and it ends. Like, for instance, let's say a nuclear winter apocalypse for humanity. That is a pretty shitty dead end to Source's eternal dream. And so it won't let that happen. And it won't let you access more creation or more of its creative powers if you don't have the right level of consciousness. So you could say that there's still, for instance, atoms somewhere in the past that have not understood, for instance, how to create molecules and how to behave like in a sort of an organized fashion, and they're bumping into each other and destroying themselves. And they're stuck in that kind of dimension, and they're doing their thing. And if they want to access higher experiences, higher dimensions of creativity, they need to abide by the laws of chemistry, and here the molecules have to abide by the laws of biology, unless they want to sort of react and with each other until eternity within this circular kind of dream or story. And you could say that's why this nuclear explosions are explained by, many channelers and many people talk about ETs really being worried about our nuclear weapons. Why? Because you can imagine that by exploding a nuclear weapon in our reality, what you're doing is you're actually creating a breach between these dimensions where you are pooling the original chaos that existed somewhere in the past or somewhere in another dimension, where atoms still don't behave like molecules and still bump into each other and in a very chaotic way. You're actually bringing that chaos back into the future where it has no business being there. So you're tearing a portal. You're creating sort of a portal where you tear through several dimensions of order, where things have begun to structure themselves into molecules, into living cells, into humans, and you're tearing a portal through those dimensions and then bringing the original chaos that from atoms that don't behave like molecules, like living cells, like humans, back into our reality, which brings more chaos too much chaos into our 3D reality, where it has no business being there. And of course that reverberates also into the future, into higher dimensions, let's say. Because if you bring more chaos into yours, it reverberates across all timelines and all dimensions. So that's one explanation why using nuclear weapons is not a good idea. And I hope you understand now a little better the whole concept of time, and the fact that, of course, we'll never reach infinite consciousness, because those are the two extremes where source just exists. So zero and infinity is what exists, but it cannot experience itself, and everything in between is where you have the experience. That is our reality. And those two questions that continuously sort of bounce between those two extremes. I'll stop here. If you have any questions, just feel free to let me know, and maybe we'll be discussing other matters related to this in the future.